Nothing says I value our 25 years of marriage quite like announcing your midlife crisis affair in front of 50 guests while they're still digesting their overpriced salmon. There I was, in my custom Diane von Furstenberg wrap dress that cost more than most people's monthly mortgage, holding a champagne flute that suddenly felt like it might shatter between my fingers. The June evening had been perfect. Catered by Fairfield's most exclusive chef, our colonial mansion's backyard transformed into a high-end soiree venue, and every important name in Connecticut's finance world gathered to celebrate my husband's milestone birthday. Everett Harlow, now officially half a century old, stood tall at the center of our meticulously landscaped patio, his Brooks Brothers suit tailored to hide the slight paunch he'd developed from too many business dinners. His silver-peppered dark hair caught the golden hour light in a way that still, infuriatingly, made my stomach flip after 25 years. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," he said, raising his glass as the conversation dimmed. Our guests, a curated collection of Fairfield County's elite, turned their attention to him with practiced politeness. Reaching 50 has made me reflect on what truly matters in life. I smiled proudly from my spot near our twins, Maddox and Marley, both home from their senior year at Dartmouth for the occasion. My perfect little family tableau, preserved like an Instagram post with just the right filter. "And what I've realized," Everett continued, his voice carrying across our heated pool and professionally illuminated garden, "is that life is far too short to delay our dreams." Appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd. I nodded encouragingly, mentally patting myself on the back for the surprise golf trip to Pebble Beach I'd arranged as his gift. How thoughtful of me to anticipate his midlife desire for adventure. "Which is why," he paused dramatically, "Daphne and I have decided to chase ours together." The confused silence lasted approximately 4 seconds before my brain connected the dots between my husband and his perky executive assistant, who I suddenly noticed was standing near the hydrangea bushes, looking entirely too comfortable at my husband's birthday party. "We'll be leaving Connecticut next month to sail the Mediterranean," Everett announced with the enthusiasm of a man who'd just been released from prison instead of a man announcing the nuclear explosion of his family. "It's always been my dream." Funny, in 25 years of marriage, he'd mentioned this dream exactly 0 times. Unless you count his occasional comments about liking the Yacht Week commercials on TV, which I had stupidly interpreted as, "Let's maybe rent a boat sometime," not, "I'm planning to sail off into the sunset with my secretary," and Odessa. He turned to me with the casual tone of someone asking to pass the salt, not detonate a quarter-century of matrimony. "I want a divorce." The collective gasp from our audience was so forceful it nearly blew out the decorative tiki torches. I watched our neighbors, colleagues, and so-called friends transition from shock to that distinct expression people get when they're mentally drafting the texts they'll send the minute they reach their cars. Our twins froze beside me, Marley's champagne glass suspended halfway to her lips, Maddox's normally confident posture collapsing like our family's future. But here's the thing about being a financial director at Merrill Lynch with 15 years of steady promotions behind me. You develop an impressive poker face. So while internally I was calculating the exact trajectory needed to hurl my champagne flute directly at Everett's Adam's apple, externally I maintained the pleasant smile I'd perfected during countless mind-numbing corporate dinners. "Well," I said, my voice somehow steady, "that's certainly an efficient way to save on marriage counseling." A nervous titter rippled through the crowd as I set my glass down on a nearby table with deliberate care. The silence that followed was the auditory equivalent of watching a car crash in slow motion. "How convenient," I continued, walking toward the gift table with measured steps, "because I have the perfect going-away present." I retrieved the gold-embossed envelope I'd placed among the wrapped packages earlier that evening, originally intended as Everett's real surprise instead of the decoy Pebble Beach trip. Inside was confirmation of a significant investment I'd made in his name for our retirement, which now seemed like a cosmic joke at my expense. But as I held the envelope, a flash of memory surfaced, a discrepancy I'd noticed in the company's quarterly reports 3 months ago. Something about transaction authorizations that didn't quite add up, signatures that looked rushed, numbers that seemed just slightly off. Details I'd mentioned to Everett in passing that he'd dismissed as accounting quirks. I turned the envelope over in my hands, a plan crystallizing with each heartbeat. "Darling," I said, injecting enough honey into the word to cause diabetes. "While you were busy planning your grand escape with Daphne, I was noticing some irregularities in the company's client accounts." Everett's smile faltered, the first crack in his self-satisfied facade. "In fact," I continued, moving toward him with the envelope extended like a peace offering, "I've compiled quite an interesting dossier on how your travel companion has been creatively reallocating client funds for the past 3 years. Approximately $2 million worth of creative reallocation, if my calculations are correct. And they usually are." Daphne's sun-kissed glow drained faster than a Starbucks cold brew on a Monday morning. Everett's expression transitioned from confusion to alarm as I approached. "I sent copies to the board of directors and the financial compliance team this morning," I said pleasantly. "I assumed it was a simple oversight you'd want corrected immediately. You've always been so dedicated to ethical business practices." The horrified comprehension dawning on his face was more satisfying than the tiramisu our guests would now definitely not be staying to enjoy. "So, while you're explaining to the board why your signature appears on documents authorizing transfers to offshore accounts," I said, placing the envelope in his suddenly limp hand, "maybe reconsider if the Mediterranean has extradition treaties." Our audience, who moments ago had been mentally rehearsing their sympathetic platitudes for me, now stared with the riveted attention of people watching the season finale of their favorite reality show. "You're bluffing," Everett whispered, his voice lacking its previous confidence. I leaned in close enough that only he could hear me. 25 years of marriage, and you still underestimate me. That might be your biggest mistake of all." Stepping back, I addressed our stunned guests with the smile of a gracious hostess. "I apologize for the unexpected dinner theater, everyone. The dessert buffet is still available in the dining room, though I completely understand if you'd prefer to leave early and start updating your LinkedIn connections." I turned to Daphne, whose spray tan now had an unmistakable green undertone. "I'd reconsider those sailing plans. Orange jumpsuits rarely complement Mediterranean tans." The next 30 seconds unfolded in slow motion. Everett tearing open the envelope with trembling fingers, Daphne's stilettos wobbling as she backed away from her sailing fantasy and into a hedge, our twins moving to flank me in a show of solidarity that made my heart swell despite the circumstances. As Everett scanned the documents, his face performed a fascinating journey through the 7 stages of a man realizing he's spectacularly screwed. Our guests began a subtle migration toward the exits, the universal human instinct to flee someone else's catastrophic life event kicking in. Just another Saturday in suburbia. Happy birthday indeed. The thing about watching your marriage spontaneously combust in front of Connecticut's financial elite is that the aftermath requires an entirely different skill set than the average divorce. Less eat, pray, love, and more strategize, document, destroy. By Sunday morning, my inbox resembled Black Friday at a Target sale, overflowing with messages from people who suddenly remembered they needed to check on me after years of perfunctory Christmas card exchanges. The neighborhood gossip telegraph was working overtime, probably causing power surges across Fairfield County. "Mom, what's the plan?" Maddox asked, sliding a mug of coffee across our marble kitchen island. My son, the spitting image of his father minus the midlife crisis and moral bankruptcy, had always been the practical one. Marley paced nearby, her Dartmouth sweatshirt hanging off one shoulder, dark circles under eyes that had inherited my tendency to show every emotion. "I still can't believe Dad would trade in his family for a newer model with less mileage and conveniently lower expectations." I sipped my coffee. Tale as old as time in Fairfield. The only unique part is the embezzlement twist. "Are you really going to report Daphne?" Marley asked, her voice wavering between vengeance and concern. I raised an eyebrow. "Report her? Honey, by the time your father was announcing his Mediterranean fantasy, the financial compliance team had already launched a formal investigation." The twins exchanged glances, that silent communication they'd mastered since sharing a womb. "I didn't fabricate evidence," I clarified, anticipating their concern. "I simply accelerated the discovery of existing discrepancies. Truth was, I'd spotted the irregularities months ago. Small transfers, slightly altered documentation, signatures that looked rushed. Details that raised my professional antenna, but that I'd foolishly attributed to administrative sloppiness rather than premeditated theft. The irony that my own husband's affair had inadvertently exposed his mistress's financial crimes wasn't lost on me. Your father didn't just fail as a husband, I explained, opening my laptop. He failed as a CEO. The board would have discovered it eventually, with or without his public midlife meltdown. My phone buzzed with a text from Caroline Whitley, our neighbor whose Mercedes G-Wagon was perpetually parked at an angle that screamed, "I can't actually drive this status symbol." Odessa, brunch at the club tomorrow? We're all so worried about you. Translation: We're dying for details and want to be first to extract them. My phone buzzed again almost immediately. I always thought there was something off about that assistant. Remember at the company Christmas party how she kept accidentally bumping into Everett? Funny how Caroline's powers of observation only worked retroactively. At the actual party, she'd been too busy complaining about her housekeeper to notice anything beyond her champagne glass. I typed back, "Thanks for your concern. Unfortunately, I'll be meeting with financial investigators. Rain check?" Adding that little detail would ensure the news spread faster than a norovirus at a daycare. The doorbell rang, triggering an operatic barking response from our labradoodle, Winston. Marley peered through the side window and groaned. "It's Grandma and Grandpa Harlow." Perfect. My in-laws, Vivian and Sherman Harlow, living embodiments of old New England money and the belief that emotions are best stored in hermetically sealed containers never to be opened. "They've brought food," Marley reported. "Like, a lot of food. Because nothing says, 'Sorry, our son blew up your marriage' like stress eating," I muttered, smoothing my hair and straightening my shoulders. "Let them in. And Maddox, hide the good scotch." Sherman Harlow entered first, his Brooks Brothers cardigan and perpetual frown preceding him. Vivian followed, clutching Tupperware containers like they contained nuclear launch codes instead of her famous chicken casserole. "Odessa," Sherman began without preamble, "this is most unfortunate. If there were an Olympic event for understatement, my father-in-law would have more gold medals than Michael Phelps." Vivian bustled past him toward the kitchen. "I brought comfort food and sedatives. They're in my purse if you need them." "I'm not sedated, Mother Harlow, just betrayed," I replied, accepting a stiff hug that felt like embracing a mannequin. "But thank you for the casserole. Nothing aids recovery from public humiliation quite like cream of mushroom soup." "Where is Everett?" Sherman demanded, looking around as if his son might be hiding behind the curtains. "Last I heard, he was having an emergency meeting with the board of directors," I said. "Apparently sailing off with your embezzling mistress raises some corporate governance concerns." "Who knew?" Vivian nearly dropped her Tupperware. "Embezzling? Surely there's been a misunderstanding." "The only misunderstanding was me thinking my Ivy League-educated husband could recognize a financial crime happening under his nose," I replied. But in his defense, he was distracted by planning his grand escape. Sherman's face reddened to a concerning shade. "This will destroy the family name." I laughed, a sharp, bitter sound that startled even me. "The family name? Your son announced he was leaving his wife of 25 years for his assistant in front of 50 people, and you're worried about the family name?" "We raised him better than this," Vivian murmured, clutching her pearls like they might offer moral guidance. "Clearly not," Marley interjected, her voice tight. "Because Dad seems to think abandoning his family is an acceptable birthday activity." An awkward silence descended, broken only by Winston's toenails clicking on the hardwood as he investigated the food containers. My phone buzzed again. A text from Eleanor Robertson, HR director at Harlow Financial Strategies, and the only person at the company I genuinely respected. Board meeting in progress. Security escorted D from building with personal items. E looks like he's about to vomit on the conference table. I showed the message to the twins but kept it from my in-laws. No sense giving them cardiac events in my foyer. "Well," I said brightly, "who's hungry for betrayal casserole?" Over the most uncomfortable early lunch in recorded history, Sherman attempted to negotiate as if my marriage were a struggling subsidiary that needed restructuring. Perhaps if you two simply talked— About what? I interrupted. His sailing itinerary? The most efficient packing methods for fleeing one's responsibilities? The tax implications of embezzlement charges? Odessa, Vivian chided gently. Marriages hit rough patches. This isn't a rough patch, Vivian. It's the Mariana Trench with sharks. My phone lit up with another text from Eleanor. Board suspended E pending investigation. Chief Financial Officer taking temporary control. D claims E knew everything. Well, well, well. The plot thickens like Vivian's overstarched gravy. I think, I said, rising from the table, that you should prepare yourselves for some unpleasant revelations about your son. And I don't just mean his atrocious timing for public announcements. Before Sherman could respond, the front door burst open and Everett himself stormed in. His perfectly tailored suit now rumpled, his face ashen. What have you done? He demanded, ignoring his parents and children completely. I smiled with all the warmth of an Arctic winter. I've done nothing but notice financial irregularities, which is literally my job. What have you done is the better question. They've suspended me, frozen my accounts. Daphne is being questioned by actual investigators. How inconvenient for your Mediterranean plans, I replied, leaning against the counter. I hear prison has rather limited sailing opportunities. You planned this, he accused, jabbing a finger toward me. You set this up. Maddox stepped between us. Dad, you need to leave. This is my house. Actually, I interjected smoothly, it's our house. And given that it was purchased with funds from a company now investigating you for financial impropriety, I'd be careful about making ownership claims at the moment. Everett looked around wildly, finally noticing his parents. Mom, Dad, tell her she can't do this. Sherman stood, his expression hardening. What exactly is going on with the company finances, son? Nothing. It's a misunderstanding. Daphne handled some transactions. Daphne handled them right into offshore accounts. I finished for him. Funny how that works. The room fell silent except for Winston's hopeful sniffing at the forgotten casserole. The Harlow family tableau, once picture-perfect for our annual Christmas card, now resembled a freeze frame from a particularly dramatic episode of Succession. You won't get away with this, Everett said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. I smiled, channeling every wronged wife who ever maintained composure while her world imploded. I'm not the one trying to get away with anything, darling. That would be you, and frankly, you're doing a terrible job of it. By Tuesday morning, the Harlow family scandal had evolved from suburban whispers to Wall Street Journal headlines. Nothing says, your life is imploding, quite like seeing your husband's company troubles described in financial jargon right next to the NASDAQ updates. Harlow Financial Strategies, under investigation, CEO and executive assistant facing questions about missing client funds. I folded the newspaper with surgical precision and added it to my growing collection of evidence. The dining room table had transformed into command central. Laptop, legal notepads, financial statements, and enough coffee mugs to suggest I'd opened a Starbucks franchise. Mom, you need to sleep, Marley said, appearing in the doorway in her running clothes, hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. Sleep is for people whose husbands don't publicly announce their infidelity and inadvertently trigger federal financial investigations, I replied, highlighting another suspicious transaction. Dad called again, she said, her voice carefully neutral. He wants to meet with you. I'm sure he does. Unfortunately, my schedule is packed with picking up the pieces of my shattered life appointments. The doorbell rang for what felt like the 100th time since Saturday. Maddox intercepted it before I could move. It's Mrs. Peterson from next door, he called out. She brought— Is that a pie? Tell her thank you, but we've reached our pity pastry capacity, I said without looking up. Too late. Barbara Peterson, retired elementary school principal and neighborhood intelligence operative, was already making her way to the dining room, pie in hand. Odessa, you poor thing, she exclaimed, eyeing my makeshift office setup with poorly disguised curiosity. I brought pecan, your favorite. Interesting assumption, given I'm allergic to pecans, a fact I'd mentioned at every neighborhood potluck for a decade. How thoughtful, I said, closing my laptop. Though I'm more focused on nuts of the husband variety at the moment. Barbara perched on a chair like a bird preparing to swoop on roadkill. Everyone's just shocked. Everett seemed so dependable. Apparently, his dependability came with an expiration date, I replied. 25 years to be exact. And that assistant. Barbara's eyes widened. The rumors about the money are currently being investigated by actual authorities rather than the Fairfield rumor mill, I interjected smoothly. So perhaps we should let them do their job. Barbara looked disappointed but rallied quickly. Well, if you need anything, a time machine to go back and marry someone with integrity, a fast-forward button to skip this particular chapter, hazard pay for emotional damage, I suggested. My phone buzzed, a text from Eleanor. Board meeting ended. They've found evidence of systematic client fund diversion going back 3 years. E claiming he was manipulated by D. She's telling a different story. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not the numbness of shock, but the clarity that comes with absolute certainty. While everyone had been distracted by the spectacular implosion of my marriage, I'd been connecting dots that had been right in front of me for months. Barbara was still talking. Something about her cousin's divorce and how she'd found love again at 60 with her pickleball instructor. I nodded politely while sending a quick text to my lawyer. I hate to cut this short, I said, standing up, but I have an appointment. Oh, with a therapist? My niece knows an excellent one who specializes in... With my financial forensics team, actually, I replied, enjoying the confusion on her face. The betrayed wife routine is just my day job. My actual career is following money trails. After shepherding Barbara and her poison pecan pie out the door, I turned to find Maddox leaning against the wall, arms crossed. "You've figured something out," he said. It wasn't a question. I smiled for what felt like the first time in days. Let's just say your father severely underestimated both his wife and his executive assistant. And that was his second biggest mistake. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the sleek downtown offices of Merrill Lynch, surrounded by 3 senior financial investigators, my lawyer, and a representative from the SEC who'd joined via video conference. "So you believe," said Martin Fields, head of financial compliance, "that the discrepancies you identified in Harlow Financial's client accounts indicate a pattern of systematic fraud rather than isolated incidents?" "I don't believe it," I replied, sliding a folder across the table. "I can prove it." For the next 40 minutes, I walked them through what I'd pieced together. A complex scheme of small transfers, falsified authorizations, and misdirected client funds. The genius was in its subtlety. Nothing large enough to trigger automatic alerts. Everything disguised as legitimate business expenses. "And you think your husband was aware of this?" asked the SEC representative. "My soon-to-be ex-husband," I corrected, "approved every transaction. His signature is on every document, though some appear to have been signed in haste. Or forged," suggested my lawyer. "That's for handwriting experts to determine," I acknowledged. But what's indisputable is that either Everett was complicit in the fraud, or he was criminally negligent in his oversight responsibilities as CEO. And the assistant, Ms. Sinclair? I leaned back in my chair. That's where things get interesting. Daphne may have executed many of these transactions, but she wasn't the architect. The room fell silent as I pulled out my final piece of evidence, a flash drive I'd retrieved from our home safe. 3 months ago, I noticed minor discrepancies in some client accounts. I mentioned them to Everett, who dismissed my concerns. But I started keeping my own records, just in case. I pushed the drive toward Martin, including emails between Everett and the firm's offshore partners dating back 4 years. Martin's eyebrows shot up. "You had access to his emails?" "We shared a home computer for personal use. Everett would often log into his work accounts from home and remain signed in. His password for the computer was Dartmouth 2023, our twins' graduation year. Not exactly Fort Knox-level security." My lawyer suppressed a smile. The SEC representative leaned forward. "Mrs. Harlow, are you suggesting your husband orchestrated this scheme and potentially set up his assistant to take the fall?" "I'm not suggesting anything," I replied coolly. "The evidence speaks for itself. Daphne Sinclair may be many things, including the woman my husband left me for. But based on these records, she's more likely a pawn than a mastermind. The irony wasn't lost on me. In defending the woman who'd helped destroy my marriage, I might be damning my husband even further. But my analyst's brain couldn't ignore the patterns, even when my wounded heart wanted simple villains. "We'll need to review all of this," Martin said, gathering the materials. "Of course," I nodded. "And I'm prepared to testify if necessary." As we left the meeting, my lawyer touched my arm. "You realize what this means for your divorce proceedings?" I smiled thinly. "That I married a man who may go to prison for financial fraud." Yes, that had occurred to me. "It means you have significant leverage," he clarified. "If criminal charges are filed, Everett will be desperate to make a deal." The elevator doors closed, and I watched the floor numbers descend. I don't want a deal, I want the truth. When I arrived home, the twins were waiting in the kitchen. Marley had stress-baked enough muffins to feed a small army. "How'd it go?" Maddox asked, studying my expression. "Well," I said, setting down my briefcase, "your father's Mediterranean sailing adventure may be redirected to a federal correctional facility." "And Daphne?" Marley asked, pushing a plate of blueberry muffins toward me. "Turns out your father's midlife fantasy might be the one taking the fall for his midlife reality," I replied, accepting a muffin. "The investigators are looking into whether he set her up to be the scapegoat while planning their grand escape." Maddox whistled low. "That's cold, even for Dad's recent standards." "The thing about men like your father," I said, breaking off a piece of muffin, "is that they believe their own mythology. Successful, brilliant, untouchable. When that fantasy collapses, they'll sacrifice anyone to preserve it, even the people they claim to love." "So what happens next?" Marley asked. I took a deep breath, feeling oddly lighter than I had in days. "Next, we prepare for the storm. Because when Everett realizes what's coming, he'll either confess everything or fight like hell to save himself." Maddox's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then looked up with wide eyes. "It's Daphne," he said incredulously. "She wants to meet with you. Says she has information you need to hear." The final piece of the puzzle was about to fall into place. The Starbucks near Fairfield Town Center wasn't my first choice for a clandestine meeting with my husband's mistress, but Daphne had insisted on neutral territory. As if any place in Connecticut could neutralize the fact that she'd been planning to sail off into the sunset with my husband of 25 years. I arrived 15 minutes early on Wednesday morning, secured a corner table with good sightlines to the door, and ordered a venti Americano. Black, like my current outlook on marriage. "You sure you don't want something stronger?" asked the barista, a college-age girl whose name tag read Ashley. "You've got that I'm about to confront someone who ruined my life vibe." "Is that a special menu item?" I replied. "The soon-to-be ex-wife frappuccino with an extra shot of betrayal?" Ashley laughed. "Town this size, word gets around. For what it's worth, my mom says you're handling it like a boss." I raised an eyebrow. "Your mom? Nancy Winters? PTA treasurer? She said watching you at that birthday party was better than the season finale of The Real Housewives." Wonderful. My personal tragedy had become Fairfield's favorite reality show. The bell above the door jingled, and Daphne Sinclair entered. Without her usual polished office attire, she looked younger, almost vulnerable in jeans and an oversized sweater. Her normally perfect blonde hair was pulled into a messy bun, and her signature contoured makeup was noticeably absent. She spotted me and froze momentarily, like a deer realizing it had wandered into a wolf's territory, before squaring her shoulders and approaching. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, sliding into the chair opposite mine. "Curiosity trumps contempt," I replied, studying her face, though not by much. "I deserve that," she admitted, fidgeting with a paper napkin. "But what I don't deserve is prison time for something Everett orchestrated." I took a measured sip of my coffee. Interesting opening statement. Not, "I'm sorry for helping destroy your marriage," but, "I don't want to go to jail. At least your priorities are transparent." Daphne's eyes flashed. "I'm not here to apologize for the affair. That's between you and Everett. And the 50 guests at his birthday party," I added dryly. "That wasn't my idea," she said quickly. "The public announcement? The Mediterranean plans, that was all Everett. He told me it would be cleaner that way. Clean as a guillotine, I muttered. Get to the point, Daphne. Why am I sharing oxygen with you in a public coffee shop? She reached into her bag and pulled out a thumb drive. Because I kept receipts. 4 hours later, I was sitting in my lawyer's office for the second time that week, watching his expression cycle through disbelief, shock, and something approaching admiration as we reviewed Daphne's evidence. This is comprehensive, Richard Barnwell said, scrolling through another document. Emails, transfer authorizations, meeting recordings. She's been documenting everything for over a year. Self-preservation, I noted. She realized she was being set up as the fall person. And recorded conversations where Everett explicitly instructs her to make transfers? He paused, searching for the right word. Stupid? I suggested. Arrogant? Typical? Incriminating, Richard finished. With this evidence, the prosecutors will focus primarily on Everett, not Daphne, which is exactly what she wants. And what about you? He asked, leaning back in his chair. What do you want out of this, Odessa? I considered the question. Revenge? Justice? A time machine? All tempting, but insufficient. I want what I've earned, I said finally. 25 years of partnership, supporting his career while building my own, raising our children, managing our lives. Half of everything isn't just legally fair. It's actually generous considering the circumstances. Richard nodded slowly. With this evidence, we can push for more than half. I smiled thinly. I don't want more than half. I want exactly half, awarded publicly and legally. And then I want to watch him lose the other half to the legal system he thought he could outsmart. Poetic, Richard acknowledged. And the company? The board will likely oust him completely once the SEC gets involved. The company can survive with new leadership if they act quickly to distance themselves from Everett. I've heard they're already considering rebranding as Summit Financial Partners. I stood up, gathering my things. Schedule a meeting with Everett and his lawyer. Tell them I'm willing to discuss terms. He'll think you're caving, Richard warned. Good, I replied. Overconfidence has always been his Achilles heel. The showdown happened Thursday afternoon in Richard's conference room. Everett arrived with Terrence Maxwell, a shark-like divorce attorney known for representing wealthy husbands in Fairfield County divorces. Everett looked terrible, designer suit still impeccable, but his face haggard, dark circles under bloodshot eyes. His confident swagger had diminished to a shadow of itself. Odessa, he nodded stiffly, taking a seat across from me. Everett, I replied pleasantly. You look awful. Mediterranean dreams not working out? His jaw tightened. I'm here to be reasonable about the division of assets. How generous of you to be reasonable about dividing what we built together after you publicly humiliated me, I said, arranging my papers with careful precision. Maxwell cleared his throat. We're prepared to offer a fair settlement. Mr. Harlow will retain ownership of Harlow Financial Strategies, the primary residence, and his personal investments. Mrs. Harlow will receive the vacation property in Vermont, a lump sum of $1 million, and monthly support of— No, I interrupted calmly. Mrs. Harlow, this is a generous— Maxwell began. I held up my hand. Let me save us all some time. I'll be taking half of everything, the house, investments, retirement accounts. And Everett will be publicly stepping down as CEO of Harlow Financial Strategies, effective immediately. Everett laughed, though it sounded hollow. You're delusional. The board won't force me out over marital issues. No, I agreed. But they will over federal financial crimes. The color drained from his face. What are you talking about? I nodded to Richard, who slid a folder across the table. Evidence that you orchestrated a systematic fraud scheme over the past 3 years, using Daphne Sinclair as your proxy. Everett didn't touch the folder. These are baseless accusations. Really? That's interesting, because the SEC doesn't think so. Neither does the FBI's Financial Crimes Division, which opened a case yesterday. You're bluffing, Everett said, but his voice lacked conviction. The board meeting scheduled for 9 a.m. tomorrow isn't to discuss quarterly projections, Everett. It's to formally remove you and announce cooperation with federal investigators. Maxwell was flipping frantically through the folder, his expression growing more alarmed with each page. "Where did you get these?" he demanded. "It seems Daphne had an insurance policy," I replied. "She recorded your instructions, saved your emails, documented everything. Smart woman. Terrible taste in men, but excellent self-preservation instincts." Everett's face contorted with fury. "She betrayed me?" The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. "Betrayal seems to be going around," I observed. "Must be something in the Fairfield water supply." "This is blackmail," Everett hissed. "No, this is consequence," I corrected him. "You committed actual crimes, Everett. Financial fraud, wire fraud, possibly money laundering depending on where those funds ended up. I'm not blackmailing you. I'm giving you a chance to do one honorable thing before your world completely implodes." "Which is?" he asked, voice barely audible. "Sign the divorce agreement giving me half of everything. Resign from the company with a public statement taking full responsibility for the financial irregularities, and I'll tell the prosecutors you cooperated voluntarily." Maxwell leaned toward Everett, whispering urgently. Everett shook his head, then buried his face in his hands. "You've already been questioned by investigators, haven't you?" I guessed. "That's why you look like yesterday's leftovers. They're closing in, and you know it." "You've ruined me," he said hoarsely. "No, Everett, you ruined yourself. I'm just making sure you don't take me down with you." The pen shook in his hand as he signed the agreement. As we left the building, Richard gave me an appraising look. "That was masterfully executed." I shrugged. 25 years in finance teaches you how to close a deal and recognize when someone's cards are all bluffs. My phone buzzed with a text from Marley. News alert just hit. Dad resigned from the company. Board announced financial irregularities under investigation. I smiled. Sometimes justice arrives on schedule. 4 months can change everything. The leaves had transformed from summer green to autumn gold. The Fairfield gossip mill had found fresher scandals to dissect, and I'd transformed from poor Odessa Harlow to that financial analyst who took down her husband's empire. October in New England has a way of clarifying things. The crisp air, the vivid colors, the sense of endings and beginnings happening simultaneously. I sat on the deck of my lakefront property in Vermont, the one I'd mentioned in our divorce negotiations, and then purchased outright after the settlement, watching the sunset paint the mountains while nursing a glass of ridiculously expensive Cabernet. "Mom, the lasagna's ready," Marley called from inside. Our traditional Sunday family dinner had relocated but not disappeared. Some traditions are worth preserving, even when everything else changes. I found Maddox setting the table in the open-concept dining area, the wall of windows framing the lake view like a living painting. Winston trotted in from the yard, his labradoodle coat picking up every autumn leaf in a 5-mile radius. "Dad's sentencing is tomorrow," Maddox said without preamble, placing silverware with precision that reminded me of his father in better days. "I know," I replied, refilling my wine glass. "Are you going?" He shook his head. "Finals week." But Marley was thinking about it. My daughter appeared from the kitchen, oven mitts shaped like lobster claws on her hands, a housewarming gift from Eleanor, who'd been promoted to CFO at what was now officially called Summit Financial Partners after the board renamed and restructured the company. "I want to be there," Marley said, setting down the steaming lasagna. "Not for him, for closure." I nodded. "That's your right. Just don't expect a heartfelt father-daughter moment. White-collar criminals facing prison time aren't known for their emotional generosity." After Everett signed our agreement that day in the lawyer's office, events unfolded with the swift inevitability of dominoes falling. The board ousted him unanimously. The SEC filed formal charges. The FBI executed search warrants on his office and the offshore accounts. Most surprising was Daphne Sinclair's immunity deal in exchange for her testimony. Turned out she'd been documenting Everett's instructions for over a year, ever since she realized the financial restructuring he'd asked her to help with was actually systematic fraud. "Did you ever think," Maddox asked as we settled around the table, "that Dad's midlife crisis would end up being the best thing that happened to you?" I paused, fork halfway to my mouth. "That's a philosophical stretch worthy of your liberal arts education." "I'm serious," he persisted. Look at you now. New house, consulting firm taking off, profile in Forbes' Women in Finance issue. You're thriving. Success is the best revenge, Marley added, passing the garlic bread. Isn't that what Grandma Vivian always says? Your grandmother says that while simultaneously holding 3-decade grudges against bridge club rivals, I pointed out, though I do appreciate that she and your grandfather have made an effort to stay in touch despite everything. The twins exchanged one of their telepathic glances. What? I asked, recognizing the look. We've been talking, Maddox began carefully. About Dad. I sipped my wine, waiting. He wrote us again, Marley continued, asking for us to support his appeal for a reduced sentence. And? I kept my tone neutral despite the flare of anger. And we're not going to, Maddox said firmly. What he did, to you, to the company, to those clients, it wasn't a mistake or a bad decision. It was calculated. The affair with Daphne we could eventually forgive, Marley added. People make personal mistakes. But the fraud, setting her up to take the fall, the lying for years, that shows who he really is. I studied my children's faces. So young, yet already wiser than their father had been at twice their age. The hardest lesson I've learned, I said after a moment, is that we can love people without trusting them, and we can forgive them without forgetting what they're capable of. That's very zen of you, Maddox commented, reaching for more lasagna. Don't confuse wisdom with exhaustion, I replied dryly. Holding on to anger is just too much work at my age. I'd rather use that energy to build something new. And I had. After the divorce settlement gave me half of our assets, I'd launched a financial forensics consulting firm specializing in fraud detection. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all me. My phone buzzed with a text from Barbara Peterson. Channel 8 just previewed tomorrow's coverage of the sentencing. Using your Forbes headshot for comparison with Everett's mugshot. Thought you should know. I showed the message to the twins, who burst out laughing. The ultimate before and after, Marley snorted. From power couple to power imbalance, Maddox added. I raised my glass in a toast. To unexpected plot twists. Later, after the twins had gone to bed, I stood on the deck again, wrapped in a cashmere throw against the October chill. Winston curled at my feet, his warm presence oddly comforting. The stars over the lake seemed impossibly bright, unobscured by Fairfield's light pollution and social expectations. 25 years ago, I'd married a man I thought would be my partner in building a life. The life got built. Beautiful children, successful careers, material comfort. But somewhere along the way, the partnership became a facade. I'd spent months asking myself what I could have done differently, what signs I'd missed. But the truth was simpler and harder. Everett had made choices. So had I. And so had Daphne. We'd all played our parts in this particular suburban tragedy. Tomorrow, a judge would determine Everett's fate. But mine was already unfolding. On my terms, by my design, with an authenticity I hadn't experienced in decades. The broken pieces of my former life had been reassembled into something stronger, like those Japanese bowls repaired with gold seams. The cracks weren't hidden, they were highlighted, transformed into the most valuable part of the new creation. Sometimes the ending of one story is just the spectacular opening line of a better one.